Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the third in my series of conversations with the political historian David Klemperer about political conversions. What happens when people completely switch sides? And today, we're bringing the story much closer to the present, though we're starting again in the 1930s. This is about Trotskyism and what happens when people leave Trotskyism behind. Where do they end up? Neoconservatism is one place, but it's not the only place. From James Burnham to Claire Fox, where do the Trotskyists go? David, we're going to talk about a set of intellectual political journeys today that are clearly connected with the topics we've discussed so far. And this story also starts in the 1930s. But it has a different arc, a different trajectory, and it brings us much closer to the present. So today we're going to get well beyond the 1930s, but we're going to start there because we're talking about journeys out of Trotskyism, basically, and into a whole range of things that sometimes get labelled neoconservatism, but that's possibly too broad or loose a label. But we should start with Trotskyism itself. So would you be able to characterise what made a Trotskyite mindset, in the context of the stories we've been discussing so far, different maybe in the 1930s? So we're talking about people who've come out of that anti-Stalinist milieu, particularly in the United States, but not exclusively in the United States. So what was the thing that they were leaving behind? How would you characterize the Trotskyism that they were about to abandon?
I think the defining feature of Trotskyism is that it is in some ways the most oppositional position that you can possibly have. Because as a Trotskyist, you're a revolutionary Marxist, you're committed to the overthrow of capitalism, but you are also opposed to the main, most powerful left-wing movement. You are viciously opposed to the communist parties, the official communist parties, which tended to be much, much, much more powerful. So it is a position that is inherently a minority position, an unpopular position, and a very radical position. And Trotskyist groups always are engaging with things in Marxist terms. So people who come through the Trotskyist tradition come out of this very ideological world where politics is always analysed in terms of classes, in terms of different class fractions, and also in terms of the possibilities for revolution. Because Trotskyism is this minority creed, it is based on trying to look around for what opportunities there might be. What are the new tensions? What are the new divisions? It is an activist Marxist creed that sits in opposition to most big established organisations on the left in whatever country it's dealing within, and is trying to combine theory and practice all the time, Marxist theory for understanding politics, but also looking for opportunities to make headway, to foment revolution, to engage in some kind of activism.
And was it, would you say, inherently factional in the sense it's oppositional, this is a minority, and then there are often minorities within the minority? A parody of this kind of politics is the Judean People's Front of Judea version of it. And yet when one reads about it in the 30s and 40s, that parody is not a million miles away from the truth. It does feel like a mindset, a milieu, in which, as well as taking on all of the big people, you're also watching your back against people who might just be down the corridor.
Absolutely. And I think it comes out of that kind of oppositionalist mindset, which is that whereas people who go into the mainstream Communist Party, to some extent, are willing to accept this central line, they're willing to ignore their own kind of doubts and fears about what the Soviet Union or the Communist Party may really be like, those who go into Trotskyism are taking this critical attitude. And to be a Trotskyist is to care intensely about, often from the outside, very kind of technical seeming debates about the class nature of the Soviet Union or about the precisely appropriate revolutionary strategy in any given political situation, which means that Trotskyist movements are shaped by cultures of very intense internal debate, but also of regular splits. And this can actually make it quite difficult to trace the history, because so often you're dealing with parties that merge and split and merge and split, and different factions and group schools all maneuvering against each other within this very small world of Trotskyism.
So one of the people we're going to talk about today, James Burnham, who's a fascinating and very significant figure in 20th century thought. He does come out of that world, 1930s American Trotskyism. And I think his experiences of it during the 1930s are a version of the thing that you've just described. It was highly factional, sectarian. But by the end of the decade, into the 1940s, he wasn't just going to break from this group in the name of that group. He had a version of the thing that we've been talking about, a kind of loss of political faith. So tell us a bit about Burnham and his background before we get on to the shift that happened and his really significant book that he published in 1941. What do you think characterized his experiences in the 30s?
Burnham was always something of an unusual Trotskyist. He was from a wealthy family, and he was a very successful and privileged academic. He'd been to Oxford, he'd been to Princeton, and he was a philosophy professor at New York University. And he came to Trotskyism, having originally been skeptical of Marxism, partly through the influence of one of his colleagues, Sidney Hook, and partly through traveling around America and witnessing the poverty of Great Depression era America. And he comes into Trotskyism and immediately throws himself into this acrimonious debating culture, constantly writing critiques of other people's versions of Marxism, always trying to defend his particular approach to Trotskyist politics. And a notable feature of these debates at this time is Trotsky himself is involved. Trotsky is writing to his followers and participating actively in these debates. And Burnham is frequently writing either with or against Trotsky. And Burnham's attitude to Trotskyism really begins to evolve in the late 1930s as a result of a dispute over the nature of the Soviet Union. So at this point, the problem Trotskyists have is they need to explain what the Soviet Union is. They think something's gone wrong. They think it's not a well-functioning communist state. But what does that mean the Soviet Union is? Is it capitalist? Is it something else? Now, Trotsky's line is that the Soviet Union is still a workers' state, but it's a deformed workers' state. It's one in which bad leadership is leading it astray, and this may mean that in the future, capitalism could come back, but for the moment, it's still a kind of flawed socialist state. Now, Burnham increasingly comes to doubt this. He begins to see the bureaucratic leadership of the Soviet Union as not just people at the top of a good society making bad decisions, but as representatives of a new kind of state and society. And so from the late 30s, he is increasingly disagreeing with Trotsky over this question. And in 1940, he eventually breaks with the Trotskyist movement over this question and also a more sort of esoteric philosophical debate over the nature of dialectical materialism. So it's this classic Trotskyist split. You're debating theory, but it's also a theory with very substantive implications for how you think about politics. Because the view that Burnham comes to is that the Soviet Union is not socialist, it's something new and different.
Is the implication of the Trotsky view of this that essentially it's a worker state, it's gone astray because of its leadership, but if you swapped out Stalin and put Trotsky in place, it might be okay? And Burnham's view was that wouldn't make any difference. In the end, actually, something has happened here, something structural has happened here, which means that changes of leadership are essentially irrelevant.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Trotsky's argument was essentially, with Trotsky on top, it would all have been fine. And this is something that a lot of people who come through Trotskyism eventually end up criticizing. Burnham, meanwhile, comes to a much, much more radical set of conclusions, which is he looks at the Soviet Union and he goes, this should actually upend our whole notion of socialist revolution. This fundamentally changes the Marxist story. And he begins to tell this new story in his 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution, What is Happening in the World Today.
To connect it back to what we were talking about last time, one of the staging posts on Burnham's rejection of Trotskyism was the Nazi-Soviet pact. For many people, I said it last time, say it again, this was a really shattering event. I don't think for Burnham it was shattering so much as confirmatory of something that he was beginning to suspect, that actually if you wanted to understand what the Soviet Union was, part of what you have to do is compare those features of Soviet politics, which you can also see on display in fascist Germany. So were these two regimes to find themselves in alliance with each other in the world historic situation of 1939, you shouldn't throw your hands up in horror and say this is a travesty. You should think this actually tells us something about an affinity here, which you wouldn't see if you thought the ideology of these regimes defines their character.
And one thing that we begin to see in Burnham's thought in this period that really continues is he becomes very skeptical of ideology. He becomes extremely cynical about people's words and what they say they're about. And in some ways, this is a kind of classic Marxist skepticism, which is you've got to look at the kind of economic things or the power things underneath. But I think Burnham really takes this to a new level. And so what he does in the managerial revolution is he argues that capitalism is collapsing, and in the Soviet Union, capitalism has been defeated, but it has not been replaced by socialism. The workers aren't ruling the Soviet Union, and in Burnham's view, they probably couldn't. That probably is an impossibility. What's happened instead is that a new managerial class of bureaucrats and technocrats have taken over the state. And what Burnham crucially does in the managerial revolution is he takes this analysis of the Soviet Union and he begins to apply it to other countries. So he argues that Nazi Germany is an example of the same phenomenon. It's a state in which capitalism has been replaced by the rule of a new class of bureaucrats and managers. And he also begins to argue that this is what's happening in the United States. This is what the New Deal is. FDR's New Deal is replacing capitalism with the rule of bureaucrats and managers in the form of New Deal agencies that are springing up in the US.
And the fact that in the American case, it's being done more or less without violence. And in the other two cases, violence is part of the engine of control in these totalitarian societies. For him, was that incidental? Because we talk about someone whose journey is going to take him to being essentially a full-throated defender of the American way of life. In 1941, was he still willing to say there was a fundamental difference between the way these regimes exercise power and control, the way these new managerial classes, these people are bureaucrats, but in the Nazi case, they're also murderers. In the Soviet case, they're also murderers. In the American case, they're not.
I think for Burnham, that isn't actually a particularly significant fact. And I think that throughout Burnham's life, he's someone who doesn't really have a problem with violence. Even as a teenager, he writes about how violence could potentially bring forth a new kind of society well before he's even a Marxist. So I don't think violence is the key thing for him. He does see a difference between the United States and Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which is firstly, he thinks that the United States is less far down that path and retains greater possibilities for some kind of democracy. Now, it's always difficult to know what Burnham means when he talks about democracy. It's one of these words which he's very skeptical of because he sees it as potentially just covering up different forms of power. But he does seem to have an idea in the managerial revolution that there could be some kind of opposition and that in America there is more scope for forces other than the technocrats and managers that could potentially in some way temper their rule.
Another Marxist perspective of this time that came to a similar but different set of conclusions about what connects Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, FDR's New Deal America was the thought of the Frankfurt School. And there are overlaps as well as very significant differences between these two outlooks. But Burnham wasn't the only person who started to wonder whether you were seeing a convergence of political types across these large industrial and soon to be at war societies having to manage huge labour forces in the aftermath of the Great Depression. For the Frankfurt School, the thing that connects these different regimes is a form of authoritarianism. So for the Frankfurt School, it's not a new kind of class analysis, the managerial class. It is authoritarianism. And for people like Horkheimer, Adorno, then Marcuse, the way out of this new authoritarianism, which is, in a sense, the late stage of capitalism, is a sort of emancipatory philosophy. With Marcuse, it ends up being a politics of erotics or whatever it is. Burnham's not that version of how you get out from this. So what is the difference between the Burnham view that across these three societies, these three political regimes, you're seeing a new kind of control which doesn't fit conventional Marxist analysis? It can't be understood as a workers' state. There are parallels between the Soviet Nazi and FDR versions. And the Frankfurt School idea that there are also parallels across these versions because late-stage capitalism takes this authoritarian form.
I think a crucial difference is that Burnham has given up on the possibilities for some kind of liberatory social order beyond this. I think a general feature of Burnham's thought is, one, there's always a kind of inevitability to it. And Orwell actually critiques Burnham for this. He said Burnham looks at whatever trend is happening and goes, this will continue, this will be the future. And I think there's some fairness to that. And the other thing that Burnham has is he has these great geopolitical flights of fancy, in that he's always trying to explain these kind of geopolitical trends as well. And so he imagines a world divided into three blocks: the European bloc under the Nazis, the Asian bloc under the Soviets, and then an American bloc under the New Deal American state. And then I think for Burnham, the only solution to this isn't some kind of liberatory or revolutionary solution. It's something much more cynical that can potentially temper the control of one particular group. And so during the war, Burnham writes another book called The Machiavellians, Defenders of Freedom, where he turns to a range of different theorists, in particular Machiavelli, but also Michels, Pareto, and Mosca, to argue that we can look past ideology, that we can understand the workings of power, and that there are ways in which power can be tempered, not by a new kind of society, but simply by opposition forces to power. Burnham's view is power can constrain power, and you can have some system in which there is a level of circulation of elites that prevents any one group from permanently exercising a tyranny. So it's a view that there's a way out, but it's not really a way forward. It's stopping tyranny from becoming too embedded, but there's no revolutionary horizon. It's a very pessimistic and cynical politics.
The way you describe it there makes it sound like this is a clear repudiation of Marxism, in contrast, say, to the Frankfurt School, who remained nominally at least Marxist. I mean, not just nominally, actually, they remain Marxist. And one of the ways in which Burnham is repudiating Marxism is he does abandon the idea of liberation. And without liberation, Marxism is a pretty thin philosophy. The Frankfurt School do not abandon the idea of liberation. They look for all sorts of different versions of it. But it's as though he's abandoned liberation but retained the determinism. So he's abandoned the dialectical materialism, but something has lodged in him from his Trotskyite or maybe even earlier days, which is that there are forces at work in society, material forces at work in society, that do determine political outcomes. And there isn't an awful lot that you can do to buck those trends.
Yes, and I think another factor to this that means you can't buck these trends is that Burnham sees material forces at work, but he ceases to particularly see them in economic terms. And so in his turn to the Machiavellian theorists, his argument is no longer that it's the quest for accumulation, for wealth, for economic goods that is driving things, but simply the quest for power itself. Power is self-justifying. It's no longer a means to a particular kind of economic settlement. The managerial class aren't running things for wealth, they're running things for power. And you can see this set out very clearly in the famous work of fiction that's based on Burnham's ideas, which is George Orwell's 1984. The party in 1984 isn't interested in a particular economic system, it's interested in power. And that's exactly what Burnham thought was going on in a place like the Soviet Union. The new class that are ruling the Soviet Union aren't doing so with a particular economic end in mind. They're doing so because they wish to exercise power.
And in 1984, the three great power blocks of the world, they are not distinguished by their ideology. They are simply fighting an endless power game, and they are all staffed by apparatchiks like O'Brien and others, who are presumably more or less interchangeable. I mean, is 1984 a satire of the managerial revolution?
I think to some extent it is. It's taking Burnham's view of the future and going, this is what this would look like. And I think Orwell sees it as a risk, but I think he's also, you can see in his reviews of the book initially, he's kind of skeptical of Burnham's claims and thinks that Burnham is just too impressed with power. Burnham sees whoever is winning and thinks, this is the wave of the future.
During the Second World War, Burnham went to work for the American government. He worked with, among others, George Kennan, the architect of containment, the post-war doctrine for defeating the Soviet Union. And I said at the beginning that one of the terms that's used to describe the journey of someone like Burnham is from Trotskyism to neoconservatism. He became a cold warrior. He became a defender of the American way of life and a really determined, not just critic, but opponent of Soviet power. Is neoconservatism the word for where Burnham ends up? Where does he end up, would you say?
So I would say he absolutely ends up as a conservative. I think neoconservatism, it's a very contested term. It's used to mean a lot of different things. But I think being fully historically specific about it, I think we would keep neoconservatism for a particular milieu that turns up later. So there's, I think, a lot of overlap between Burnham and neoconservatism. But I would say he ends up simply as a conservative. And the best embodiment of this is that he is one of the co-founders with William Buckley of National Review, which is the straightforwardly conservative outlet, as distinguished from neoconservative outlets that emerge some years later. So I would say Burnham ends up as a conservative, but a conservative whose ideas and whose trajectory very much influence later neoconservatives. And I think we can see Burnham's shift to conservatism in the thinkers who dominate his thinking at different points. So in the 1930s, Burnham is primarily interested in Marx and Trotsky. In the 1940s, he's primarily interested in Machiavelli and these very cynical theories of power. And eventually in the 1960s, in Burnham's one of his last books, The Suicide of the West, a critique of liberalism and how liberalism is undermining America in the face of communism, Burnham turns to Edmund Burke. So there's this shift from revolutionary thinker to a kind of cynical realist thinker, and lastly to a conservative thinker in terms of who Burnham is using to ground his ideas.
And as he moves to this conservatism, what does he think should be done about the managerial class? So there is that sense that something inevitable is happening here, that capitalism is going to be a system in which a group of managers, apparatchiks, it may also include certain kinds of intellectuals, will dominate. And we're going to take the story up to the present, in which the managerial class become the enemy for a certain strand of right populist thinking. Can you see the beginnings of that in Burnham as he becomes more and more conservative, as he wants to defend the American way of life against the threat of Soviet communism? Where do the managers stand? Are they going to defend America, or are they part of the problem?
Burnham's thought in the post-war period is primarily, of course, anti-communist. He has this view, this very almost conspiratorial view of the Communist Party as nothing but a power-seeking elite that are trying to extend their power everywhere, and he favors an extremely aggressive foreign policy approach to counter them. Domestically, he combines this worry about the rise of the managerial class and their growth of their power that he expresses, for instance, in his book about the American congressional tradition and its weakening in the 1950s. But he is in some ways more resigned to it than a lot of his fellow conservatives. So Burnham wants to find ways to check the rise of the managers and limit their power and prevent them from becoming all dominating. But at the same time, he isn't a libertarian. So compared to his fellow writers for National Review, he's much more comfortable with the managerial state's existence, and he doesn't think you can roll it back. So he supports Rockefeller for president rather than Goldwater.
Is his journey the template, do you think, of a whole series of similar journeys that happen half a generation or a generation later? Again, groups of American, New York, almost exclusively intellectuals who start out as Trotskyists, and within that world, that factional, highly ideological world, and they move outside of Trotskyism towards something that does eventually get called neoconservatism. Many of them found magazines along the way. So that's part of this journey. One of the stepping stones on the journey is which magazine are these people associated. So I'm talking here about people like Irving Kristol, Irving Howe, Nathan Glazer, and others, many of whom knew each other. Gertrude Himmelfarb, they're not all men, but they're almost all men. This group, unlike Burnham, who interestingly was born into a Catholic family and I think died a Catholic, but gave up his faith in between. These people, again, are almost exclusively Jewish, often second-generation immigrants. So there are very big differences with the Burnham story, but do you think that is the template, that the thing that we've just described with Burnham fits this slightly later generation through the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, who move from Trotskyism to this full-throated Cold War conservatism that gets called neoconservatism?
I think it is the template, and I think you can see similar things in terms of the way this anti-Stalinism becomes central to their politics, and that turns them into a particular kind of Cold Warrior, but also the way in which both cases, this analysis of Stalinism and the problems of Stalinism ends up shaping their views of domestic politics. And I think possibly the most important thing about Burnham is not him as a template, but him as someone who provided, I think, a kind of key intellectual tool that later neoconservatives use, which is this idea of the new class of managers, and that is a central way of understanding politics.
The new class of managers for this next generation as the enemy?
Yes, although they adapt it in a new way. But I do think that when we look at neoconservatism and how it comes to crystallize itself as a political tendency in the 1970s and how it comes to define its enemies, the idea of the new class, something they take from Burnham but adapt to be specifically not a new class within capitalism, but a new class against capitalism that emerges not from within the private sector, but from within the kind of public and charity sector. That is central to how the neoconservatives understand what's happening in American society and how they turn their critiques of the things they don't like into a kind of political program.
Because he said of Burnham, he wasn't interested in ideology, but in a way he was quite relaxed about the fact this regime is violent, this regime is not. The range of different values that might ostensibly be embodied by these different regimes didn't bother him because he was looking at this set of structures. But in this next generation of former Trotskyites, cultural relativism is one of the things that really does start to bother them. They think that in a managerial society, actually one of the things that you get is a hollowing out of values, a hollowing out of culture, not just in the public sector, but eventually one of the obsessions becomes in universities too. I mean, we're on a journey here which is going to end up in the culture wars. We're just not there yet in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In that way, do you think this is actually a step change towards a version of these arguments that are closer to where we are now than to where Burnham was in the 1940s?
Yes, I think that's right. I think that Burnham comes up with a new way of describing class conflicts, but what later generations of neoconservatives do is they start applying this to the culture war, and they start explaining the cultural conflict in class terms and seeing the cultural conflict as more important than any kind of economic dimension to it.
And can you find the origins of that outlook in their Trotskyism? In the sense that one of the questions about all of these political conversions is, do these conversions reflect the place where the people started out? So with people like Crystal or Howe, do you think you can trace in where they end up, where they started?
I think you can, and I think it's the desire to explain a cultural conflict that they're interested in class terms. I think that is where you can see the influence of their early Trotskyism. Someone like William Buckley doesn't particularly feel the need to do this, but someone like Irving Kristol does want to explain, in a kind of deeper sense, the kind of cultural conflicts that he's seeing and wishes to intervene in.
So where did this generation think that the class fissure in American society lay? Is it the entrepreneurs against the managers? Is it the workers against the managers? If the managers are the enemy, and this could include bureaucrats, civil servants, culturally relativist lefty professors, and the rest, whose side are they on?
I think the key thing to understand the later generations of neoconservatives, the ones who come from the New York intellectuals, who come out of Trotskyism, is that they, by the 1950s, are part of mainstream liberalism, mainstream anti-communist liberalism, and they have essentially come to accept and celebrate mainstream American society. I think in a more kind of full-throated way than Burnham had. Burnham switches so quickly from hardcore Trotskyism to an anti-liberal position, whereas the neoconservatives are spending the 1950s as almost sort of centrist, post-ideological liberals. Irving Kristol is the editor of Encounter, the big anti-communist magazine. He co-edits it with Stephen Spender, and in his writings there, you can find very sympathetic accounts of books by socialists, but also of conservatives, as long as they're part of this sort of democratic, liberal mainstream. And where the neoconservatives start to go more right wing is when they start critiquing what they see as the attacks on this from the New Left, a New Left that they see as very sympathetic to communism. And where they end up drawing the divide, I think, is between ordinary Americans who are invested in this American society and a new class that has a cultural opposition to mainstream American society. And so when specifically writing about the new class, Irving Kristol very interestingly distinguishes between the corporate managerial class, people Burnham had originally seen as part of a kind of unified managerial class, and for Kristol, these people are basically a good thing. Corporate capitalism works, it's delivering the goods for the American people. The problem, however, is that there is a class of people who are outside of corporate capitalism, who are in the public sector, who are in the universities, who are in non-government organizations, who are in the media. And these people have a different set of values, and a set of values that threatens to undermine the American society that Kristol has come to accept and celebrate.
And have these people essentially captured the language starts to creep to a language which would be familiar in the 21st century, but I don't want to get there too soon, was the view that in a way, one of the threats to America and American society was a kind of insidious capture of these institutions. So universities, the media, government agencies were actually being infiltrated from within by these new left cultural relativists. So that, again, it has an echo of a world in which you can imagine what you're most interested in is this sectarian anxiety about which clique has entered which clique to take it over and applied it at large to American society. But we're not quite in the 21st century culture wars yet, are we?
I don't think so, because I think there's less of this kind of conspiratorial tone. I think it's more of an analysis of the cultural ideas and where they come from economically and how they threaten to undermine the good things in American society. So Crystal's worry, for instance, is that the new class in the public sector will overregulate capitalism, will try too many pointy-headed programs to improve things, and this will make things worse. So a key phase in Crystal's turn to the right is in the 60s when he becomes a critic of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And one of the things that makes someone like Crystal a neoconservative is that he says he doesn't want to roll back the New Deal. He thinks the New Deal was a good thing. He likes the society that has been produced by the 1950s. But he's worried that in the 1960s, liberals are taking things too far, and that the new welfare programs pushed by this new class, who have a particular set of outlooks based on the kind of institutions they come through, are doing programs that aren't going to work, that are going to create problems, and that are ultimately going to undermine society.
So that set of arguments then introduces a new category as well as class, which is race. So when we were talking about the God that failed, one of the themes that recurred in the contributors to that book's accounts of why they came in to communism was that it transcended race. And it was this great liberatory movement in a world in which racial hierarchies seemed entrenched. And here was the one ideology that was going to smash that. By the time we get to the 1960s and these arguments about the Great Society program and Lyndon Johnson and defenses of the New Deal is fine. The New Deal is the kind of democratic politics that we believe in. But this 1960s version has gone too far. One of the ways to understand that is that the New Deal was essentially a project that didn't touch America's racial hierarchies. It left Jim Crow intact in the South. FDR got it through Congress essentially by conceding to white Southern senators their racial hierarchy in return for their support for this project. And the beneficiaries were primarily the white working class, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. The Great Society of LBJ was different, and a big part of that project was now to extend the New Deal across the racial divide. Once race enters this story, it becomes much more distinctively American, it seems to me. But also, the rhetoric, the thrust of these arguments starts to feel very different. Again, I don't want to take it into the 21st century too soon, but that feels to me like a big shift. The way you framed it, New Deal okay, LBJ and the Great Society too much. I can't help hearing that as essentially an argument about race.
I think that's right. I think that you have to understand the neoconservatives are mainly Jewish intellectuals who have successfully integrated and become a part of American society. They see America as this great melting pot in which minority groups can successfully come in and integrate and play a leading role. And they want to do that. They want that to work for Black Americans. But I think they are very skeptical of the idea that American society needs to fundamentally change to allow this to happen. And I think they have a kind of bootstraps attitude here as well. They go, well, we successfully integrated, we became successes. Why can't Black Americans do the same thing? And this leads to a kind of cultural critique of race relations in America, which puts the problem on the shoulders of Black Americans themselves rather than on American society or its institutions. So a key document here is the Moynihan Report, where a Democratic senator analyzing poverty amongst Black Americans argues that a large part of the problem is cultural. And the neoconservatives see this as absolutely key and very much agree with this analysis that great society programs aren't going to be enough. There needs to be a cultural change for integration to succeed.
So this then does become an argument about values. So someone I mentioned there, Gertrude Himmelfarb, who was married to Irving Kristol, she was essentially a historian of Victorian Britain and the values of Victorian society. And she wrote a whole series of books which were about the importance of family values and others in a Victorian sense for 20th century America. These arguments they certainly aren't inherently racist arguments, but they did very quickly get enmeshed in 1960s and 1970s arguments about race. And this is also the period. So you've just mentioned a set of people, and As you pointed out, they were Democrats. That is, they were members of the Democratic Party. The shift in American politics from the Democratic Party being the party of the South to the Democratic Party being the party of the North and vice versa happened in the 1970s, essentially. It turned on the question of abortion, and abortion is the ultimate value question in American politics. But for a lot of these people, this journey does also end up with them as Republicans, doesn't it? I mean, it's not simply, the Republican Party had to change too. It's not just that they changed, the American party system changed as well. But it is part of that broader shift in which you could be a Democrat in the 1950s and 1960s and end up in the 1980s as a Reagan Republican.
I think a key turning point here is McGovern and McGovern's victory in the Democratic primaries before the 1972 presidential election. Because I think the way I would understand neoconservative politics is you have a kind of defensive attitude towards the America of the 1950s. You support sort of bourgeois American values. You like the setup. You're very anti-communist. And you see this challenged by the Great Society, which threatens to undermine the social fabric, and by the New Left, to which these people had a real, I think, aversion and even disgust. And it's relevant that a lot of these people are academics who are facing student revolts on their campuses that they are very, very hostile to. Student revolts that seem to them anti-American and pro-communist. But what I think gives these critiques real political bite is the idea that they can be subsumed into this broader phenomenon of the new class. And McGovern is essentially, for the neoconservatives, the epitome of the new class. He has put together this new class coalition that has replaced the traditional Democratic coalition they tended to like, one made up of established minority groups, trade unions, the sort of thing they would have been familiar with in New York politics, Jewish groups, Catholic groups, trade unions, and has replaced it with this sort of new class coalition. And for them, that's very alienating and seems to symbolize what they want to resist within liberalism. So Irving Kristol in 1972 votes for Nixon, and that is a real moment in terms of his move to the right and the whole set of people around him becoming neoconservatives rather than simply more centrist liberals.
Given they were also interested in power as Trotskyites, as people who were inspired by Burnham, the other fact about the McGovern coalition is it got absolutely crushed. It looked like a losing coalition. It's not a million miles from the coalition that elected Obama, so it's not like that coalition always loses. A skillful politician can put together a version of that coalition and win. But in 1972, it looked like a losing ticket.
And I think the way in which the neoconservatives start to present themselves is they are defenders of ordinary Americans' folk wisdom and values against the views of this sort of alien new class that is rising and threatens to undermine what is good about America. And you see this in Irving Kristol, and you see this in subsequent generations of neoconservatives who are, if anything, more violent in their rhetoric.
And some of the rhetoric that was used against Obama has its roots in the rhetoric of that time. I want to ask you one more question about the American case, and then I want to talk a bit about the British version of this story. The thing that people probably most associate with the term neoconservatism is the Iraq War. The neocons were held to be responsible for that. And as an extension of that, neoconservatism as a full-throated defense, not just of America in Cold War terms, but a willingness to use military force, to arm yourself and to fight, if necessary, on the battlefield. That may be a caricature of some of these people and indeed of neoconservatism, but it's one of the things that is associated with it. For this group, for the people who started out as Trotskyites, and this is relevant for the British case too, to be honest, for the people who started out as Trotskyites, do you think there is a connection, there is a thread that you can see through that they end up defending something very different from where they started, but defending it in some ways in a similar way? That is, this is robust, it is willing to embrace force, and force as the solvent of political power. And people who don't think in those terms are in the end going to be on the losing side.
I think you often get this idea that you can frame the war in Iraq as a kind of ideological crusade based on a utopian idea of promoting democracy that you can tie back to Trotskyism. I do think that somewhat struggles because of the different generations of neoconservatism. The French historian Justin Vaser, for instance, has written a history of neoconservatism that divides it into different ages. And you have different waves of neoconservatism, essentially. And the wave that comes out of Trotskyism, I would say, is much more focused on domestic policy. It's certainly hawkish in foreign policy, but it's much more focused on domestic policy. And these people don't tend to be the same ones who are later pushing the war in Iraq. There is a straightforward generational difference. Irving Kristol comes through Trotskyism. He isn't politically active by the time the Iraq War is taking place. And in what he's arguing in the 90s, he's not arguing for a big ideological crusade approach to foreign policy. He's arguing for something much more limited and realist. His son, however, Bill Kristol, a second-generation neoconservative, is involved in the Iraq War. But I think that given his background, you can't say it's descended from Trotskyism. So I think we need to be careful with where we stop drawing the links to Trotskyism. And I think the Iraq War probably is taking it too far.
And yet in the British case, it does look slightly different. So I'm sure I wasn't alone. Many people at the time were somewhat struck by the fact that during and after the Iraq War, broadly speaking on the left, some of the most vocal defenders of that war, Christopher Hitchens, David Aronovich, Nick Cohen, were in their youth Trotskyites. And then the case was occasionally made, though it's a bit of a stretch, that the other example of this is Tony Blair, in the sense that Tony Blair, I think he said he was a trot for about 3 weeks. He read Deutsch's famous biography of Trotsky when he was a student. He doesn't fall into the category of someone like Christopher Hitchens or David Aronovich. But nonetheless, there did seem in the British case to be some correlation between people who, like the generation of Americans we've been talking about, in their student days were Trotskyists.
I think in the British case, you can draw that connection because you have people who were themselves Trotskyists who later support the Iraq War. And I think you can point to two things that relate to their Trotskyism there. The first is a commitment to anti-authoritarianism as a central political value, whereas people on the Stalinist left are willing to defend authoritarian regimes if they're geopolitically sympathetic to them, if they're anti-American or if they have pretenses of being left-wing. A Trotskyist is going to be very committed to anti-authoritarianism. And so you can see that ultimately justifying something like the Iraq War. And I think the second thing that I think can't be overlooked is a antagonistic and almost counter-suggestible attitude to the wider left. If you're a Trotskyist, you've probably often spent your time arguing with other people on the left, and in some ways define yourself against the mainstream of the left. And I think you can see that with the sorts of people you mention, that their skepticism of the mainstream left and its tendencies that they will have carried through from their Trotskyist critiques of Stalinism and Stalinist sympathizers ultimately shapes how they respond to the left's opposition to the Iraq War and almost get counter-suggested by that into being sympathetic to it.
And that story has echoes right the way through to today. There are people on the left who find it hard to detach themselves from their sympathy for the Iranian regime, even though it is a profoundly authoritarian regime. But again, there are those, I think, with roots on the more Trotskyite parts of the left, for whom the war that's going on at the moment is not necessarily and obviously a bad thing. So another British case I want to ask you about, or a couple of them anyway, are the case of Frank Furedi and Claire Fox, who also began within Trotskyism in British politics and have gone on a slightly different journey. Say Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens, it feels to me, not least because he took out American citizenship after the Iraq War, fits that American pattern. Christopher Hitchens is not a million miles away in the arc of his story from people like Crystal father, not Crystal son. But Frank Furedi and Claire Fox, just say a little bit about them and how you would characterize the journey that they have been on from Trotskyism to something. I'm not sure what the something is. I'm not sure in either case I can characterize where they've ended up, although Claire Fox has ended up in the House of Lords, which is not an obviously Trotskyite institution. What's their journey?
Frank Furedi was the leader of something called the Revolutionary Communist Party that was a Trotskyist group founded in 1978. And throughout the 1980s, the Revolutionary Communist Party, or the RCP, was basically very unusual amongst British Trotskyists and tended to define itself in opposition to what other Trotskyists were doing. So this is essentially the maximally counter-suggestible position. Not only are you a Trotskyist, you are different to all the other Trotskyists. And so the RCP have a mixture of kind of classically revolutionary Marxist positions, but also a lot of very surprising positions that seem largely a way to wind up other Trotskyists. They were unsympathetic to the miners' strike. They were critical of the NHS. They once counter-picketed a nurses' strike, at the same time as having very maximalist positions on immigration. They were against all forms of border controls. On Ireland, they were very openly sympathetic to terrorist actions committed by the IRA. And they combined this with these views that in some ways seem very right-wing, largely because they were trying to outflank other Trotskyists. And what you see with the RCP is that the belief in revolutionary Marxism itself as a political project disappears in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapses. But these kinds of broader ideological instincts remain very much there. And so in the 1990s, they are taking a very pro-technology view because they're interested in radical progress and expanding the bounds of humanity in a very kind of Trotskyite way. And they're very anti-statist. And they've taken this from their 80s Trotskyism. It was also very hostile to the British state, but it becomes libertarian in the 1990s. And so they end up, under New Labour, constantly criticizing New Labour for its nanny statism, for its regulations, and also criticizing the environmental movement for opposing the possibilities of human progress. And then this also all gets expressed in class terms. As ever, Trotskyists see things in class terms, and the RCP network, which despite the formal disbanding of their party, continues to exist through organizations like Spiked, their newspaper, and through organizations like the Academy of Ideas. There's a whole network now of organizations run by people who are involved in the Revolutionary Communist Party, who have this shared political outlook based on counter-suggestibility, based on belief in science and progress, based on a kind of libertarianism, and also, above all, based on hostility to the liberal ruling class. And it's this set of views that they express in opposition to a ruling elite that in some ways you can trace back to these ideas of a new bureaucratic class. And today, I think what's happened with the RCP is these people who were on the left in the 80s are now essentially aligned with the Conservative Party. So Munira Mirza was a member of the RCP who ended up working for Boris Johnson. Claire Fox was put in the House of Lords by Boris Johnson. And it's this group of people who, having been on the left, are now firmly aligned with the right. And I think the central thing you can see that has continued in their politics is hostility to what they see as the ruling class, only now, instead of a capitalist ruling class, that is a liberal ruling class. And if you look at what they're up to today, it tends to be sympathy for various kinds of right-wing populism. Not necessarily, I think, because they are substantively sympathetic to right-wing populism, but because if you're a Trotskyist, you see yourself as opposing the ruling class, and if you've now understood this in cultural terms as the liberal ruling class, then what you're interested in doing is finding any forces that you can almost direct against it. And today, if you go to the festivals of ideas run by former members of the Revolutionary Communist Party, like the Battle of Ideas, you'll find a huge amount of engagement with right-wing populism, precisely because it is this new rising force that is opposed to the liberal elite that the former members of the Revolutionary Communist Party have defined their politics against.
Does that story have echoes of Burnham in it still, in the sense that the new class that they have identified, it's the 21st century version of Burnham's managerial class, or do you think it's something different? So it exists in some of the same institutions. This is very much a counter-suggestible libertarian version. I don't think Burnham ends up as a counter-suggestible libertarian in that sense. But can you see a line that runs from the managerial revolution in 1941 to Claire Fox and the Battle of Ideas today?
I think you can, because in both cases it's class analysis without economics. Burnham is trying to replace economics with power seeking, and what the RCP do is they replace economics with culture. You actually get this even to comedic extents in their insistence on defining everything in class terms, even when it seems to run up against the material realities of class. So around the time of the recent by-election in Gorton and Denton, where the Green Party candidate was a plumber, you actually had the editor of Spiked, the post-RCP journal, write an article saying, well, she doesn't count as a plumber because you'd never see her reading The Sun or taking a break from work to check football scores, which is essentially taking class and turning it into this purely cultural category where your class-based position is entirely dependent on your cultural outlook and values and behaviors. And so I think that is what you can link to Burnham. Obviously, Burnham is, I think, doing something much more sophisticated and interesting. But in both cases, it's this initial Trotskyist class-based view of things that then loses its material economic basis and becomes a new way of thinking about those in power and ultimately attacking them.
And these examples raise what is in some ways the fundamental question of this whole series of conversations that we've been having, which is, seen in one light, this is a move right across the political spectrum. These people start out on the far left, and Claire Fox ends up put in the House of Lords by Boris Johnson. It's hard to frame that as anything other than a huge political volte-face. And yet, on the other hand, as you've described it, it feels like there is a continuity here, and these aren't tales of political conversion. So some of the people that we've been talking about do frame it in the language of conversion, and they frame it in the language of faith and loss of faith. The God that failed is the paradigmatic example of this. These are people who understand that they came to believe something, and then they could no longer believe it. But then there are people like Oswald Mosley, who, as you said, when I said, did he think that his fascism was a passing phase and a mistake? You said, no, he absolutely, at the end of his life, defends this story of consistency and continuity. As it were, it's the world that changed. It wasn't me that changed. Do you think the people you've been talking about just now, the RCP in their later guises, fit in any way a model of political conversion? Or is this actually, in their own minds and maybe in reality, a story of continuity in which the circumstances of 2026 are so different from the circumstances of the 1970s and 1980s that the fact that they've ended up in what looks like almost the opposite position from where they started is a superficial analysis. The real analysis should say they're still defending the things that they always defended. It's everything else that's changed.
Thinking back to the people we've discussed over the course of this episode, James Burnham, I think it's absolutely a political conversion. His substantive political ends have totally changed. Likewise, the neoconservatives, like Irving Kristol, they change what it is they're trying to promote or defend. I think the thing with the RCP is I don't think they were ever really interested in the substantive ends. They were interested in being oppositional, and they were interested in being countersuggestible, and they were interested in arguing. And I think that remains the case today, even if the way in which they do that differs. So I think that it's hard for the RCP to have a conversion because that would imply too many positive beliefs in the first instance. You can absolutely point to ways in which their stated positions have totally changed, but I think that their stated positions were always secondary to a kind of pose and to a kind of approach to politics that they really reveled in. I think it's really telling, actually, if you look back to Munira Mirza's first article for Spiked in 2006, and I think it really captures something about the RCP. And the article is entitled, "Let's Have a Heated Debate About Multiculturalism." And it's responding to the idea that Britain needs a sober and serious debate about multiculturalism. And this isn't an article saying what we should think about multiculturalism. It's just calling for the debate to be more heated. And I think this really captures something about the kind of people. They want to be having this constant acrimonious debate. I don't think they're necessarily so interested in the outcome. They're in favor of whatever will make the debate more heated. I often say they don't care about having a good outcome. They just care about having a bad process.
Where we started when I asked you to characterize the Trotskyite mindset and the Trotskyite world from which these people emerged in the 30s and 40s, you said it's very much a minority outlook. So these are often very small groups. They're small groups within small groups, so they are the minority within the minority. The factionalism is explained by the scale of it. It's very small scale. And of course, it's very analog as well. So in my youth, I associate the people we've been talking about in Britain as the people who would try and sell you a newspaper on a street corner on a Saturday morning, and everybody would ignore them. They were, again, part of a world in which their outlook was a minority of a minority, and they reveled in that, and that was part of what gave it its animation and driving force. But not anymore. I mean, the thing that seems most fundamentally to have changed, even if they haven't, is that this kind of politics, let's have a heated debate for the sake of having a heated debate, is a driving force in contemporary politics, in the politics of 2026. You can make fortunes out of that outlook. You're not reduced to selling badly printed newspapers on street corners or rather forcing them on people who don't want to buy them. You can have huge online audiences. Spiked is not a huge publication, but it was ahead of its time in the model that it was promoting. There are people who are doing very well off the back of that. Thank you very much. And so one of the things it feels as though might have changed is not their attitudes, and not simply that the world is a different place, but that the information environment in which these attitudes can express themselves, for the first time in this whole story that we've been describing, really suits that outlook. It is, for the first time, the wave of the future.
I think there's something in that. And I think one of the interesting things is going to be to see how the world of the post-RCPers responds to that, because I think there's actually an extent to which they're kind of the dog that's caught the car. They wanted to disrupt the liberal elite, but now the liberal elite has been disrupted. Is it really clear that they like what's there? I actually went out of interest to the latest Battle of Ideas festival in London some months ago. And Claire Fox was running a panel, and it was the classic RCP theme. It was, are populists the real Democrats, or something like that? Something where you get to go, actually, it's not liberals who are defending democracy, it's populists who are speaking to democracy. It's actually the other way round. What then? And the debate sort of started off in the usual way. There was different people on the panel, and they were kind of making these arguments. And the way these things work, though, is that there's a huge amount of audience participation because they want to get everyone arguing. The problem that I think Claire Fox had, though, is the audience weren't there for the debate and a bit of counter-suggestibility. The audience at this point was full of people who were committed right-wing populists who wanted to simply promote their views. And so the mic goes out to the audience, and suddenly you have repeated members of the audience standing up and saying, populism is right, but why haven't you endorsed Tommy Robinson? Tommy Robinson is our leader, and we've all got to get behind him. And it ends up with Claire Fox shouting at the audience, shut up about Tommy Robinson. I don't want to talk about Tommy Robinson, which at a festival that prides itself about free speech went down rather badly with the audience. And I think there's something there, which is Claire Fox wants the counter-suggestibility. She wants these new forces to disrupt consensual liberal politics and challenge the elite. But I'm not sure she necessarily wants the substantive things that the people she's relying on actually want. I'm not sure how suited RCP politics is to being a majoritarian politics. I think they might be happier complaining about New Labour.
I was once on a panel at a Battle of Ideas many, many years ago. I haven't been for a long, long time because I can't take that kind of debate. But it was with Claire Fox, and it was the classic argument about what's real democracy. And there are lots of young people in the audience, and someone got up who was 16 and said 16-year-olds should vote and gave a speech. And I can still remember this guy sat down and Claire Fox said, if people as stupid and inarticulate as you are representative of 16-year-olds, God spare us you having the vote. And I remember thinking, well, that is bracing and that is free speech, but I don't think I ever want to do this again. I realise that today's episode is going out on April the 1st, but what I'm about to say is, I promise you, not an April Fool. The next film in our season at the Regent Street Cinema in London is on April the 17th, Friday the 17th, and it is South Park, the movie, bigger, longer and uncut. I'm going to be talking to the one-time film director, now campaigner, Biban Kidron, about a film that we think you will enjoy, and we would love to see you there. To get tickets, click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. Next time, it's the final episode in this series about political conversions, and David Klemperer and I are going to be trying to draw some conclusions and talking about contemporary politics. Why, when, and how do people switch ideological positions? And what, in the 21st century, does it all mean? That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.